To help us answer more of the question on responsible DPI, we have a great panel on our stage right now. I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Eduardo Totolo and our guests on stage. So tell us about new frontiers in data economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank, and it's great being here again. Yeah, the title of the panel is New Frontiers in the Data Economy. And essentially what we're trying to do is to bring some conversations which partially we had in this morning in the discussion on DPI about data exchange. When we talk about data exchange, essentially we talk about open banking, open finance, new models of sharing data about the users with their consent. But then we know that the use of the exchange of data in and of itself is not sufficient. Ultimately, it's about the use of that data that is being exchanged. They're increasing volumes of data. They're increasing capacity and regulatory frameworks as well that regulate that exchange of data, that mandates that exchange of data for participating institutions. But then ultimately, that data is used by some providers to develop, to design new services. And that is a stage where we move from data exchange to other discussions, such as algorithms and artificial intelligence, and the use of that data to make decisions about whether a person has access to credit or not, whether a person can open an account or not. So there are actual decisions that ultimately are made, and this is a value chain of data. That's why we use the term data economy. It's not a term that we use very often, but essentially there are several dimensions of it, and we want to look at that value chain more broadly. Of course, within this value chain, there's a lot of discovery, there's a lot of open questions, and we're trying to understand what the opportunities are, but also what the risks are. And we know that there are emerging risks that we are learning about every day, and I think some of them emerged this morning as well. And so to have this conversation and to bring in these different perspectives, we have a fantastic panel, I believe. I'm very proud of the panel we put together. Experts in different domains, but they have expertise in this context of data exchange and the use of data through algorithms and AI. So we have here, right on my right, is Ariadne Pleitekis. She is the Senior Program Officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She's done a lot of work, especially about open banking a number of years ago, but now continues to do that work in a new hat with the Gates Foundation. So she'll tell us more about her experience. There on the right, we have Eduardo Lopez, who's representing Nubank. He's the global head of public policy. So he'll give us a perspective on data exchange, on open banking, how those models are affecting Nubank's business models, but also the use of that data through AI. Really excited about it, Eduardo. Thank you. Then we have Tarcisio Silva, who's a senior tech specialist at the Mozilla Foundation. Focus on digital rights, also as a consultant for the Brazilian Association of Civil Society Organizations. He'll talk more on that latter part of that value chain I talked about the use of AI and the potential risks that are linked to that, and a lot of insights from Brazil specifically, but also beyond. And then finally, last but not least, Shelley Anderson. She is the program director at the Alliance for Innovative Regulations. She will share some of her experience in regulatory approaches in AI, and also some practical approaches that seem to have worked in her experience through her organization. So very excited about this panel. There's a lot we'll have to cover and limited time, so we better get started. I want to start from my far right, Eduardo. We have talked about open finance. I think also earlier, at least in my table, we talked about open finance in the safeguards of DPI. Brazil is seen as an example that many countries from around the world are looking up to in terms of understanding how it works, why it is working so well, but of course with some challenges as well. Within that context, Nubank is, at least to my knowledge, you'll tell me if I'm wrong, is by far the most active player. Some of the data that we saw that is publicly available suggested that out of the data transactions, when consumers decide to move their data from one institution to the other, 50% of the times, consumers move their data from some institution to Nubank. You'll tell me if I'm wrong. That's some of the data I've seen. So incredible opportunity. I think that there's no one can give us as much insight into what is happening. So I wanted to get a sense from you. Within the context of open banking, what have been the greatest opportunities that you have seen for Nubank? And also, what innovative services have you been able to design and launch and offer to users because of that system of data exchange through open banking?
So thank you very much, Eduardo, for the question and for the invitation to be here. Just before addressing directly your question, I just wanted to take a moment to, we've been talking earlier in the morning about how PIX and how open finance and how Brazil has become a reference because of most of these two clear examples. But I just wanted to mention that these are just the result of a long term agenda that the Brazilian Central Bank has been executing to improve our regulatory environment, aiming to achieve, more inclusion, efficiency, competition. And there are a number of building blocks that, we don't see necessarily when we think of PIX and open finance, but for me they were as important as, they were enablers of this actual result. So just to name a few here, back in 10 years or 11 years ago, there was a new law in Brazil regulating means of payments. It moved, created new different licenses. These licenses, they are modular, so they are easier to access. The licensing process improved as well. The regulatory burden became proportional. So all of this allowed for new entrants, such as Nubank, to actually start working and growing and being supervised and regulated at the same time. And also, other changes that were as important as this in terms of, allowing a fully digital onboarding of customers, a regulation on cybersecurity, which is fundamental. Otherwise, you could ruin all the nice things that you do with PIX and open finance. And last but not least, also, we had a data protection law in Brazil, which is also important to make sure that we have the guardrails to operate all of this. So I think that these are building blocks that not necessarily they are as discussed as, the case of PIX and open finance, but they are enablers from my point of view, and they have been done over the past decade or so and allowed us to have such a success in Brazil. And when Brazil becomes a reference and the central bank becomes a global reference in terms of executing on this agenda, I like to think to myself that Nubank is probably one of the most prominent success cases of this agenda in practice. So when we look at the PIX data, last time I checked, over 20% of all PIX transactions in Brazil go through Nubank, in or out. And as you mentioned, similar situation to open finance, so your numbers are right. And we have 1/3 of the total consents, 1/3 of the customers that consented to open finance, they are with Nubank. So it's a huge representation. And the reasons for this, we made both a huge priority for the company. So from the very beginning. So if you look at the PIX, and Mariana was just telling the story here, from the very beginning of the discussions, we had people involved, we have our technical team involved. We believed in, we bet in the success of PIX, and actually also became our success as well. So, and when we compare PIX open finance, and I think, open finance, I would suggest that we had a similar deep dive conversation as the one did with PIX and Mariana earlier here with open finance. Maybe in the next edition of the event, you could invite Mardilson Queiroz, which leads the project within the central bank. I think that some decisions taken by the Central Bank of Brazil were really crucial for the success. We were able to build from other experiences that were done earlier, and we actually were able to, to learn from the mistakes and do an even better job, I would say. And just to name a few of these, I think that having the open finance mandatory for large institutions, super important. To have a standardized approach, especially from a technical standpoint, super important as well. A broad scope of data and services was also essential. And being free of charge, which is super important, similar to what happened to PIX, and have a combination in which, different from PIX, which was developed by the central bank, open finance is developed by the industry, by the private players. So it's a self-regulation, but closely supervised. So otherwise, it could easily get stuck and don't progress. As you know, there is a competition issue here. Incentives are not necessarily aligned. So, I mean, for an entrant, we go all in. For an incumbent, maybe we are not so excited about the idea. So, I mean, having this supervised self-regulation was super important. But finally, getting to your question, I'm sorry, keep me in check here in terms of time. So I think that for Nubank, not the secret, but I mean, it was a decision to really prioritize both. So if you look at Nubank now, open finance is among our top company priorities. That's why, I mean, we've been so successful. And what we've been doing in terms of use cases, just to make it more concrete. So one of the most liked feature that we developed, very simple actually, is balance aggregation. So within your Nubank app, you can check the balance of all of your accounts. This is super simple, but I mean 20% of our clients use it twice a month at least. So this is really something useful for them. But then we took another step and we developed the overdraft alert. What does this mean? So if any of these accounts in other institutions go into overdraft, I mean, so it goes negative, we send an alert to our client within their Nubank app, alerting, I mean, listen, I mean, you have money in other places and you are going to pay interest rates. Don't you want to, I mean, decide on whether to manage and move this money around and not to pay this interest? And this has saved millions of reais to people. And the number of people using, we alerted more than 1 million customers about this. So, I mean, they saved nearly 10 million reais in interest rates in other institutions. We also have an idle money alert, which is basically, I mean, you have money in any of your accounts, and it's been there for a while, you're not touching it, and it doesn't get any, I mean, yield to you, so we alert you about this, and maybe you want to look into other options where you could put your money in and get some yield, so you don't, I mean, you're actually wasting money by leaving it there. And finally, we do regular satisfaction surveys with our clients, and the latest one we ran, 77% of our clients that use open finance were satisfied or very satisfied with the use of open finance. So looking ahead, I think what we need is, I mean, continue to build on use cases. And there are a few challenges, but maybe I can talk about them later, not to monopolize the time here.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And then potentially so many follow-up questions. I'm trying to refrain myself from asking those. But to me, like what you just described is, I mean, there are two sides. One is the building blocks of regulation, which are absolutely essential. Basically, it starts with that, and then you have been able to build on top of those building blocks that the central bank has worked on. The second point is when it comes to use cases, it seems to me that most of them are directly or indirectly linked to financial well-being. I know that has been a core theme at GPFI. Those alerts, the capacity to understand, you know, your financial situation across different transactions. Would you say that's an accurate description of the key goal, the key use case that have been developed so far?
Yeah, I would say that the existing use cases, but as we see, we still have a huge, huge potential to explore. The reason that we haven't released new use cases, one of the reasons is that, I mean, the ecosystem performance is not there yet. So I think there is much to improve in terms of data quality, I mean, success rate. So people start a transaction in one end, it needs to be completed on the other end, right? I mean, it takes, in open finance, it takes two to tango, literally. So sometimes success rate at the beginning is very high, at the end is low, and then this compromises the user experience. So for me, that I have a huge success rate, this is an disincentive. I'm not going to roll out new features and products if I know that my client, because of the other end, will not be able to complete the transaction. So he or she's not gonna like it, and they're gonna blame me because they started the transaction within my app. So the description is right for existing use cases, but we see a lot of potential in payment initiation, for instance, with open finance, which is the ability of moving the money around and other features, but also in terms of competition, and financial well-being, I think that portability is really something huge that open finance can really transform. We have in Brazil salary and credit portability, but I mean the process is still slow, bureaucratic, and success rate is very low. So with open finance and being able to compare different offers, move your credit contract from one provider to the other because the offer is better, it will really foster competition, and I think that at the end it will help people also to manage their finances better and to really be empowered at the end of the day, because I mean the hurdles in making these moves are what make them really get stuck with one provider, even if the price is too high or the service is too low.
Well, thank you. That's really interesting, and I think a lot for us to learn in terms of the challenges of actual implementation of open banking. Implementation itself is as a challenge of compliance, and particularly incumbent banks, sometimes do not find the right incentives to participate. So I think that's a great point that maybe if we organize that deep dive that you recommended, I hope we should definitely cover. But let me go now to Ariadne. So you have worked in the open finance space for a long time. Initially at CGAP, you drove some of the early research at CGAP on open finance and how to design for financial inclusion in particular. Now, with a different role, you continue to be active in the space of open finance. In the conversations that we've been having, well, recently and in the past, one of the things that you often said is, or at least I understood, is that as you think about open finance, we need to first think about the role of data protection. Like the data protection is an absolute building block, just to use a term that Eduardo was mentioning, in order for us to then get into open finance. I wanted to ask you why you think that is so important, and also because I mean in some markets, if we look at the sequencing of events, we see that open banking regulation preceded data protection. So I want to get a sense, why do you think it's important, and if you think it can also be too stringent data protection can actually make it difficult for open banking to be linked to financial inclusion.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Eduardo, for inviting me to this panel. I'm very happy to contribute. So when we're talking about open finance, we're primarily talking about data transfers. Data transfers between institutions where customers consented to that transfer. And we have to think about the type of data that's getting transferred. Not all of it is sensitive, but a lot of it can be considered sensitive data, such as customer transaction data. It could have credit scores. It could also include KYC account data and other account opening information data, which is really closely linked to identity. And that's, for example, there's certain countries that have allowed that under the open finance. In fact, Brazil is one of those countries that has allowed that use case. I don't know how much they've used it, but I believe it is in the regulation. And I mean, this has been an unprecedented ability to move your entire historical transaction and payment history. This empowers consumers, but honestly, it opens up some very big risks as well. There are many touch points in open finance where this data can be intercepted. And this can result in things like identity fraud, or even the loss of funds. And even the financial service providers that touch the data, they may actually inappropriately use that data. So they may, for example, use that data to predatorily target customers with other types of products, or they may pass that data on to another party without the consumers having much say or ability to consent to that transfer, and then end up being, sold to by these other third parties that they've never really had a relationship with. And this is really a serious type of consumer harm, especially if you have a data breach at one of these providers, or if the financial service providers don't actually have proper safeguards and controls in regards to data security. And it has, in particular, specific issues for certain segments of society, such as women and elderly. They may be more vulnerable due to the type of data that passes through and their relationship and concept of privacy. And further, such harms basically undermine consumers' trust, right, in open finance, and then it will actually result in lower adoption. So I know it seems maybe like a sort of something else to think about, like, not really important, but honestly, if you don't have it in place, it can undo all your efforts to try to roll out and have massive adoption of this, which I think is a great tool for consumers. So I think it's really important that we think about it. That's why I think data protection is essential. I mean, we have to realize that a lot of countries don't have a national data protection law. So, you know, it can be complicated because they may wish to want to roll out open finance. I mean, what can they do in that? Well, I mean, there are often sectoral legislation that will have some sort of data protection provisions in place. Will probably not be comprehensive, but could be a good starting point. And then, even if there's not that, when the regulator decides to implement some type of regulatory framework, they could incorporate the type of data protection provisions in that regulation. Now, there are specific types of provisions in data protection that you would need to think about when you implement open finance, because it's really complex, because you have a lot of parties here, right? We have a data processor, data controller, we have these things called TPPs, right? The data subject, we may have several TPPs, right? And so it relents itself to complex relationships, and therefore really having to think about how do we protect each one of those relationships in that chain. So the type of provisions that you really need is you need to give the consumer adequate control over its data through things like notice and consent, which obviously are sort of primordial in data protection, but also making sure that they're empowered by certain rights, like giving them access and the ability to correct and delete whatever data the financial service provider is holding. You also need to ensure responsible use of the data by the financial service providers through things like data minimization. Obviously, you need data security, and you need provisions that help to responsibly implement open finance. And these are things like regulations around record keeping, liability allocation, and complaint resolution. And obviously, I've set up a long list. There is a great technical paper put out by CGAP in 2023 that sets it out, that has a lot more details. And so, obviously, even a national data protection law may not actually have all these provisions, although I'll talk about that in a second. So what I would suggest is that regulators, when they're in the process of designing their open finance regime, they do some sort of gap analysis, get down the list of provisions that they at least minimally require, and try to identify areas where they can maybe ameliorate or improve the protection by putting it into the regulation that they're going to pass to roll out open finance. Now, you also said, and this is true, that if you look at national data protection, let's say you do have, you're a country that has one like Brazil, it's a very comprehensive law, and most national data protection legislation does not take in consideration different types of data, nor where this data comes from. So it doesn't make any distinction between health data and financial service data to marketing data. I mean, there are some countries that do that, I've seen it, but it's generally not the case. And so what happens is that it's a kind of a one-size-fits-all situation. And other work that we've done at the foundation is we've been looking into this, and we've realized that because of this, sometimes you actually have unintended consequences for financial inclusion. In that, you know, they may be lacking some sort of I don't know if you call them exemptions, but like specific considerations that you want to think about for the financial sector if you really want to support financial inclusion. So for example, provider diversity is really key in supporting dynamic competition, and part of my strategy is that if you support dynamic competition, you will also then get financial inclusion gains. But many of these new contenders are fintech, right? And of course they're going to safeguard the data, and they're going to abide by, you know, the data security provisions and, you know, the rights that they have to give to consumers and so forth. But there can be procedural elements in these national data laws that can actually basically prohibit these companies from entering in the market. I wonder, good question to ask Eduardo, if there was any parts of the LGBT that you found difficult to implement, but I know under GDPR, for example, you have to have a data protection officer, right? And if you don't have, for example, a minimum threshold in size or amount of data or something, you could have to labor every single entity, even the smallest entity, with the DPO. That is actually a significant resource. It may be disproportionate to the risk in regards to the data in that particular provider. So in that case, that provider just may start entering the market, and when it realizes that it can't really complete all these requirements, drop out. And so we're going to lose that diversity that we want. So I think there is some thought needs to be done about maybe, for example, some of the process elements in these regulations and how they adapt to different market contexts.
Yeah, and I think that what you bring up about how minorities in particular are affected by these systems of data exchange are making it a lot easier to essentially systems are making decisions about them, and the data may not reflect their actual capacity or willingness to repay or to access a service. I think it's a very important one. Now, because it links very well also to what Tarcisio has been working on, I wanted to quickly shift to that, because Tarcisio, you have done a lot of work in the last year, or the last few years really, not just about the risks that are emerging in data exchange itself, but more the data, once it's exchanged, is used by algorithms. And that is more and more common and extensive use in Brazil. You've seen that that's led to different forms of discrimination. I wanted you to give us some insight into that.
Sure. Thank you, Eduardo, for the question and the conference for the invitation. I think that something that is really key to understand the request the civil society is putting forward is that nowadays artificial intelligence is mainly a synonym of the connectionist approaches. And what does that mean? This means that big data or a good amount of data, as you mentioned, can be used to infer some relations between data, between variables, and use this data through some models with machine learning, deep learning, or specific techniques to draw conclusions or decisions. And in this sense, data is one part of the question. So I really like to mention the OECD definition about AI. It's a definition that is influencing a lot of policies around the world, including the Brazilian National Strategy of Artificial Intelligence. And the definition of AI, from the point of view of OECD, is the following. An AI system is a machine-based system that, for explicit or implicit objectives, infers from the inputs it receives, the data, how to generate outputs such as predictions, contents, recommendations, or decisions that can influence physical or virtual environments. So a key point when we think about data discrimination and bias, as some colleagues mentioned it earlier today, is how we think about the guardrails to really understand data in a more inclusive sense regarding non-discrimination, but also regarding equality. So in Brazil, like other places around the world, several examples of algorithmic discrimination are multiplying. I can mention a database that I maintain called desvelar.org. If anyone has interest, can check the website, or other databases like the AI Incident Database from OECD, or the Mozilla AI Intersection Database. So the impact of algorithmic mediation of values and content moderation, biometric surveillance, etc., are well known and documented. So in this sense, civil society in Brazil has defended some minimal civilizing points. Right now, the Senate is discussing the AI regulation in Brazil, so I want to give also a shout out to Paula Guedes, our colleague that represented civil society in the public hearings yesterday. And some of the points that we are trying to bring to AI regulation in Brazil are the following. The first one, our colleague mentioned it in some sense, is the classification of risk. Because not every kind of implementation of AI needs to have the same level of transparency or the same level of accountability. It is related to the risk of the implementation. So when we think about diagnostic medicine or recruitment or public safety, we are talking about implementation of high risk. So we need more transparency measures, such as the second point that we are really defending are the algorithmic impact assessments. among the information that must be analyzed and recorded around AI, there are some measures that can be highlighted, like the number of people impacted, the consequence and efforts required for mitigation, like when you think about health, sometimes you can even have reparation when you have algorithmic diagnosing something that you don't have, for example. So we are advocating for algorithmic impact assessments for high-risk applications. A third point that I want to mention is the banning of technologies with unacceptable risks, like social credit for government services, biometric surveillance in mass in the public space, and other implementations like using of AI, demographic, and psychographic models to influence behavior. And right now in Brazil, we do have some campaigns for banning facial recognition, including the campaign Tire meu rosto da sua mira. It's something like take my face off your aim. And finally, we are advocating for more social participation in AI. We discussed this a lot today, like centering the consumer or centering the citizen. And a key point is that currently we have 3 possible institutions to influence the regulatory future if this bill passes. One of them is the National Regulation and Governance System. The second one is a Regulatory Cooperation Council to connect with other countries' regulation and to make it possible to have interoperability. And a third one, a committee of experts from academia. So we are advocating for social participation in all of those instances. And right now, the regulators are not including that. So this is the main point that I would like to highlight. And in some sense, we can converse around the advancements and the lacks of the financial sector on this space, since it's a more regulated field in some sense.
Yeah. I think it's very interesting what you mentioned, that there are different levels of risk linked to different types of data and different uses of the data. And I think that would require a lot of discussions for us to determine and agree, even within the financial sector, which is what we focus on primarily here. Some data may be highly risky and some may not. It's not one block, and the same for other sectors. So there's an incredible level of complexity, and I feel that we've just scratched the surface on that. Moving to you, Shally. So in the discussion we had, you mentioned that you're trying to find practical approaches, but you distinguish 2 things. On the one hand is how can we, or what are the ways to regulate AI and the risks that link to that? But then there's also the other face of it, which is how can regulators use AI in their processes? And I want you to get a sense about these 2 different dimensions and what are the insights from the work that you have been doing.
Yeah, sure. Thanks everyone for inviting me here, and thank you to CFI. So yeah, it occurred to me when we had that conversation that we've been talking very much about how fintechs are using AI, how banks are using it, how those are the kind of at the forefront of developing AI tools. But what we're hearing more of is how regulators are using it. And actually, I think that's a very important point when we're having a conversation about AI and how regulators can understand more about what they're actually regulating is to actually use it themselves. So in terms of, what we've seen in terms of the regulation of AI, regulators at the moment are taking quite a cautious approach. A lot of regulators around the globe are leaning on kind of existing frameworks that they've already got in place. Regulators like the Financial Conduct Authority have stated openly that they don't see a lot of the risks that are emerging from the use of AI as net new, in that a lot of the rules that they've already got in place, GDPR, the consumer duty, are already covering, quite a lot of the risks that are coming out from AI. But the interesting thing is that AI is constantly evolving, I was fascinated at the speed in which ChatGPT kind of was releasing new versions of it. I mean, I think it was kind of every 3 months. And the amount of data that was being consumed by these models was kind of tenfold every time. So we're talking, I think I learned a new term, that the Chat GPT-4 is trained on 1 petabyte of data, which is 1 million gigabytes of data. Now, I checked my photos earlier because I do like taking photos, and I've got 11,500 photos on my iPhone, and that's 2 gigabytes of data. So when we're talking about 1 million gigabytes of data to train AI, you know, that's a huge amount that it's ingesting. And new models, you know, there's constantly new ways of using AI, new ways of manipulating the data. We've obviously very much concerned about the intrinsic biases that's within our data. You know, the world is intrinsically biased, particularly gender. So, you know, for regulators to keep abreast of the challenges that are evolving and the pace in which this is moving is really difficult. So whilst at the moment, I think we can probably rely on some of the frameworks that are already in place, as we've heard from the panel, as things evolve, regulators need to understand that there will be new risks emerging, and that they'll need to understand those. So I think from our point of view, at AIR, we're really keen to see, as I say, regulators using the technology themselves. It can be a fantastic tool for regulation to identify market harm, for example. You know, some of the biggest users of data are the regulators. They have access to a huge amount of data. They have access to a huge amount of data that no one else has access to. So being able to identify those market harms, to identify market patterns before, you know, harm is caused to consumers is really important. And then on the flip side, you know, firms are taking very different approaches. So we've got fintechs that are using it, as we've heard. There's people in the room that are using AI in terms of alternative credit scoring, bringing people into the financial system, allowing access. Obviously, on the flip side, that you can also get, you know, discrimination. And then in terms of RegTech, so regulatory technology, how firms are using it to be compliant with the regulator. This is becoming a huge market. And I think about 8 years ago, we started seeing a proliferation of firms using different AI models to make sure that they was compliant with the regulator. So I think it's quite a complex landscape in terms of AI. And obviously one of the things that I'm very keen is that people work together. So, you know, the regulators working with the private sector to understand the models that are coming over the horizon, to understand the evolving landscape, to understand the potential harms.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. And I think something that we have seen in many years working with regulators is that there's an increased volumes of requests for data that providers, licensed banks, licensed providers, they have to submit to central banks, to regulators, but then the capacity to actually use that data is quite difficult. There's a lot of data, some of it is not clean. And so the use of AI to actually build the capacity to detect possible problems seems to be like an incredibly powerful use of AI within the regulator, not just in the context of regulating AI. So I think that...
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, there's other technologies such as chatbots that can help people understand consumer complaints. The regulators can use it to understand complaint data. This in turn will help with redress. You know, if they're able to actually access that data and use it for good, I think that's where you'll start to see regulators really understanding the power of AI.
No, thank you. We only have less than 10 minutes left, and what I wanted to do is just to ask an open question to the panel. we've done some exercise in the morning. Natasha helped us distinguish the different types of audiences we have in the room. So I wanted to go around, I guess 2 minutes max each, and I wanted you to select one of the audiences that are here, policymakers, industry, private sector, or even international development institutions, and come up with a call for action for them, based on the work that you're doing, based on the perspective that you're coming in. What is a call for action? What's something that you think needs to be prioritized? Maybe let me ask with you, Eduardo.
Okay, so I'm going to pick up on the latest subject we talked about, AI regulation. So the way we see, there's not a question for if we should regulate, but how we should regulate AI. And our point of view is that, I mean, we should find a way to balance the regulation that is new with existing regulations specifically for regulated sectors such as the financial sector. So when we look at the risks that we are trying to mitigate, many of those risks are already regulated either with or without the use of AI within the financial systems. So the ask is here, let's not create a regulatory framework that will lead to doubt and uncertainty. And what do I mean by that? If we create like a new agency that will be in charge of regulating AI exclusively, how these dialogues and coexists with, for instance, the Brazilian Central Bank regulation, the SEC, the Brazilian SEC regulation. So our ask is that we should find a model in which there is some sort of prevalence of the sectorial regulator over a general regulation, and the gaps then we can fill in with the new regulation. So let's not create overlapping and conflicting rules, and let's use the expertise of decades of the specific regulators to be able to address these risks that emerge from the use of AI.
Thank you. That's very straightforward, and so you're focusing on regulators and on avoiding confusion between the financial sector regulation and the upcoming AI regulation that the government is working on, right? That's really interesting. Moving on to you now, Ariadne. I suspect you're also focused on regulators, but maybe I'm wrong. You let me know.
Yes, so I'm going to go back to the data protection theme, just so we can nicely end it with a bow. But I think I'm addressing myself, obviously, to financial sector regulators and central banks. Obviously, understand the importance of data protection, especially not just on open finance, but all the new innovative business models. Most of them run on data. They're based on cloud computing. That's why they have these new ideas. That's why they have a lot of economies and ability to bring new concepts, but they bring these new risks. And that it's really important that we have the appropriate legal frameworks in place, but let's also think about the unintended consequences of just a comprehensive national data protection law and see if we can think of ways of special considerations or waivers for types of financial sector entities. And ultimately, it's not just about the financial sector regulator, it's also about the Data Protection Authority, because obviously they're going to have a mandate under their laws. So you have to understand how to navigate that between the financial sector regulator and the Data Protection Authority. It's not always easy, and sometimes you actually have to mirror some of the data protection law components in the financial sector regulation to give yourself the mandate, but it's something that has to be thought through. And just to end, there's actually, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but the World Bank has a reference guide on digital financial services. I'm happy to send out the link. We launched it a couple of months ago. It looks at a lot of different pieces of regulation, but there's a great section on exactly what I talked about today, data protection, and particularly this idea about how to figure out collaboration and mandate issues between data protection and financial services regulators.
So increased coordination between different bodies between different regulators. And I think another dimension will also include the competition authorities. I know that's also another important competition. We haven't covered that.
Another discussion, next time.
Next year, okay. We have a theme. Tarcisio.
Thank you. I just want to aim my message to policymakers and civil society to understand how some stakeholders from the private sector are giving AI a bad name. And recently, a survey was launched in the conference Brazil-UK Forum. I recommend everyone to check these results. And the data is very frightening. Only 14% of Brazilians say they believe that AI can bring benefits to the classroom. And only 17 believe that AI can speed up disease diagnostics. This is very problematic because AI is being stamped in everything and being used by some actors in a non-responsible way, and this can really erode trust between the different sectors. So my message to policymakers is civil society is try to understand that and to look at good data. Like the same survey showed that 73% of Brazilians are supporting AI regulation. And AI regulation in countries like Brazil needs to be really broader with social participation because the sectoral regulations can be targets of regulatory capture. So we have a much work to do, and this work needs to be multi-sectoral.
Yeah. Thank you, Tarcísio. Shelley.
I feel like I can't aim mine at regulators now. I'm frantically trying to think of a new group. Mine is a little bit wider, actually. Of course, it's to regulators, because I think regulators have to be part of this conversation, and if they're not, it just won't work. So I guess my call for action is for everyone in this room to think about the outcomes that we want from AI. So we talk a lot about rules, we talk a lot about guidelines, but at the very heart of it, you know, whatever tools you use, whichever technology you use, AI is not unique necessarily. It's about the outcomes that we get from that. So are consumers protected? Are consumers safe? We've talked a lot about trust. Do consumers trust the services that they're getting? So I guess my call to action is for everyone in this room to think about the kind of ethical challenges, the outcomes that we want to see, and then work together and share your knowledge, share your experiences with each other to lean in and make sure that we get those outcomes.
Thank you. So 4 different points, most of them to regulators, I have to say. So a lot of them in the audience will be interested in that. I think we'll have also to think about what role for the private sector. That's, I think, an important conversation that will become increasingly discussed in a forum like this one. But also the role of civil society organizations. I think your point, Tarcísio, was really, really important. So thank you. That's the end of it. Please give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you.